Good afternoon. I'm Dina Mansour, Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center here at the University of Montana, and it's my honor to welcome you to the Mansfield First Take on Gerrymandering, House Districts, and Representation, featuring our wonderful board member, Tom Lopach, CEO of the nonprofit and nonpartisan Voter Participation Center and the Center for Voter Information. The Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress in 1983 to support the people of Montana, the country, and the world in better understanding issues related to ethics in public affairs, democracy, and global engagement. We honor the Mansfield legacy by bringing programs like this to communities where we hope to have a vibrant dialogue. Tom will be speaking only for about 15 to 20 minutes, so we'll have the opportunity to take a lot of your questions. So I encourage you either now or while he is speaking to go ahead and pose your question in the chat box. The Mansfield Center is located here in Montana at the university, where we support the students, the faculty, also the greater community. Critical to our mission is engaging youth. We also have a number of high school programs. This program will be recorded and shared out by teachers across the state at a later date. So I'd like to go into introducing our speaker today. As I mentioned, Tom Lopach is President and CEO of the nonprofit and nonpartisan Voter Participation Center and the Center for Voter Information. He leads a team of exceptional staff who use data-driven methods of direct mail and digital engagement to reach out to vote members of the new American majority, people of color, unmarried women, and young people, all with the end goal of helping to ensure a representative electorate in U.S. elections. Prior to serving at this organization, Lopach was Chief of Staff to Montana Governor Steve Bullock, Executive Director of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee during the 2015-2016 election cycle, and Chief of Staff to U.S. Senator Tester from 2010 through 2014. Beginning in 2009, Lopach served as Vice President of Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs for the Export-Import Bank of the United States. From 2007 to 2008, he was the National Finance Director at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. From 1999 to 2006, he worked for the late Senator Edward M. Kennedy in various capacities with his 2000 and 2006 reelection campaigns, with Kennedy's leadership PAC, and with Kennedy's official Senate office. In 1996, Lopach started his professional career as a field representative for Congressman Pat Williams in Helena. He's a graduate of Gonzaga University and a native of Helena, who currently lives and works in Washington, D.C. So we have someone who has spectacular experience in being able to speak to this topic today. So Tom, thank you so much.
Dina, thank you for having me. Thank you to the Mansfield Center. I do, before we dive in, want to flag my dog, Maxwell, is to my left on the ground. If anybody knocks on my front door or there's some noise, he will go insane, and I apologize. We'll just suffer through it. The great thing is so many Montanans know what it's like to have a dog that rules your life. Again, thank you. Let me start by ensuring we have a shared understanding of the term gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is drawing congressional districts or legislative districts in a state to aggressively favor one party or another. Oftentimes, gerrymandering is done through either packing or cracking voting populations. Packing is when you take as many voters of one party or one population and push them into one congressional district so that that district is easily won by one party. Cracking is when you spread thinly people from one party or one population across as many congressional districts or legislative districts as possible in an effort to make sure they don't have enough joined power to win a congressional district. Gerrymandering can be done by party, that's usually what's done, or it can be done in a way to pack or crack Black, Latino, Asian, people of color into one district or across multiple districts, and impact representation. Gerrymandering ultimately will maximize the majority party's power in a state and minimize the minority party's power in representation. Now, let me be clear. That doesn't mean that the majority party of 52% has 52% representation. Gerrymandering means, in most cases, the absolute maximum power for the majority party and the absolute minimum power or no power for the minority party. And the real life results of gerrymandering impact all of us, but can hurt all of us, can hurt voters, and can have negative impacts on governing. In many districts, the competitive race becomes the primary election rather than the general election, because gerrymandering often assures one party will win no matter what in a legislative or House race. And so it's all about who's going to win the primary election. In many districts where the primary election is the dominant election, the end result is to push the candidate to the far left or to the far right in order to win that primary election. Gerrymandering also creates fewer swing districts and increases incumbent power beyond what is already existing. A result of gerrymandering is you find there's less legislative compromise. There are less folks addressing the evolving needs of voters. And there are fewer moderate, centrist, and independent voices doing the work of legislating. Now, I think it's also important to look at gerrymandering in context of all that is going on. There are moments where you can convince yourself, if we could fix gerrymandering, all of government will function better. And there is some truth in this. Were gerrymandering fixed, a lot of governing could be easier. But there are a number of other factors that also pull our governance into the extreme corners. And these need to be remembered when you're thinking about governing. When I started, Senator Kennedy would tell stories about members of Congress living in DC. And you would see at the time, children of Republicans and children of Democrats would go to the same school. And members of Congress, regardless of party, would come to know one another as parents, would come to know one another through school or community activities. And some of the severe partisan taint would wash off as they got to know one another as humans. Senator Kennedy used to tell stories about when there were late night votes and families lived in DC with their senator or their representative. Oftentimes families would go down to Capitol Hill and picnic and have dinner together while the member of Congress would go in and out with votes and again, get to know one another as families. That doesn't happen anymore. And now, most of the time, the member of Congress is in DC Tuesday through Thursday and in their state or district. So there's less opportunity to know your colleagues regardless of party and to know them as humans. Low dollar fundraising has done many, many good things for our democracy. However, it also rewards those who say the most extreme things. And so low dollar fundraising can encourage a member of Congress to say something rather outlandish to encourage online contributions to support their campaign. But that doesn't always help with good governance negotiation or finding a good middle ground. Similar to low dollar fundraising, social media and social media algorithms can support folks saying the most outlandish thing, which then will result in more likes, but again pulls legislators away from a good governing middle. Finally, I would add that interest groups and television ads pushing extreme positions or uncompromised positions can also pull legislators apart from finding solutions. Now let's think about representation for a minute, which is very much impacted by gerrymandering and by who is voting. There are roughly 342 million US citizens. Of the 342 US citizens, 264 million are age 18 or older. I wasn't able to find an exact number of eligible voters in the United States. Certainly you have to reduce that by folks who have committed a felony and are no longer allowed to vote, and that changes state by state. But let's use 264 million to roughly equate to the number of Americans over age 18 who are allowed to vote. Of that 264 million eligible voters, 192 million are registered to vote. There are 72 million Americans who are eligible to vote, who are not registered to vote. Now, when you think about the 72 million eligible voters who are not registered, 71% of them, or 51 million, are people of color and young people. Young people, I will flag, we define as 34 and under. And so when you realize our unregistered population is nearly 3/4 people of color and young people, it's very concerning to think about who's voting, how districts might be gerrymandered, and are young people underrepresented in the overall electorate? Are people of color underrepresented? And the answers to those questions are a loud yes. In 2024, older white folks, again, we define older as 35 and above. I define older as over 52, but for data purposes, we'll say 35 and above. In 2024, older white folks were registered to vote at 81.3%. Young people and people of color were registered at 68.6%, a 14.7% delta, which speaks to a representation issue. When you look not at voter registration, but rather you look at who turned out to vote in the 2024 election, white folks over age 35 turned out at 75.6%. People under age 35 and people of color turned out at 58.6%, a 17% delta. If we look at those same numbers for who turned out to vote in the midterm election of 2022, we see a 23% delta between young people and people of color and white folks over age 35. So when you sit with that and you think about gerrymandering as it affects representation, you think about who's registered, who turns out. You also need to look at the whole of the US population. By 2030, 66.7% of the US population will be people under 30 or people of color. And 33.3% will be white folks over 30. It's important to think about that, because if we continue to have patterns of under registration and undervoting amongst young people and people of color, and overrepresentation of older white folks. The representation in Congress, in the Senate, in state legislatures could be rather severely unbalanced. And that could make for unbalanced governing and challenging times in the country. Now, gerrymandering is not new. And let's think about what it does with competitive U.S. House districts. Some say that gerrymandering really started around 1882. I can tell you that in the 1800s, about 45% of the U.S. House turned over every election. 55% of the U.S. House in the 1800s would keep their seats into the next Congress. By the 1940s, 80% of U.S. House members kept their seats, and about 20% changed every election. When you get to the early 2000s, about 95% of House members kept their seats from one Congress to the next, and 5% turned over. In 2024, I think most of you probably know, there are 435 US House seats. And in 2024, only 27 were competitive. In 1998, there were about 57 US House seats that were competitive. Now let's think about gerrymandering and who draws the districts. It's controlled by individual states who draw their own districts. In Montana, we have an independent redistricting commission. I'm going to give some partisan numbers, but I don't intend for this to be partisan, but rather factual. In 2024, states that were controlled by Republicans, governors and legislators, drew 184 House districts. Of that 184, 5 were toss-ups and 2 were strong Democratic seats. Now, of course, that's a subset of Republican-controlled states, but still it paints a picture. In 2024, Democratic-controlled states drew 75 House districts, 4 were toss-ups, and 5 leaned Democratic, and the rest, 66 seats, were solidly Democratic. And as you know, the very few competitive, those 27 House seats, end up determining control of the House of Representatives. Now, as we think about gerrymandering, it's also important to think about race and representation and congressional districts that are oftentimes referred to as minority-majority districts. These are districts where there is a significant Black, Latino, Asian, Native American population, and they oftentimes vote for a representative from their own community, which helps increase or ensure representation in the House from folks of all racial backgrounds. Currently, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 prevent congressional districts from being drawn so that Black, Latino, Asian, Native American voters have their votes diluted, and intentionally keeping them from having representation in the House. Now, allow me to use Louisiana as an example, because they are currently in front of the Supreme Court, and it's a rather bold and clear example. After the 2020 US Census, the Black population in Louisiana was about 33%. They have 6 congressional districts in Louisiana. The legislature drew the congressional districts. Let me back up a second. When you've got 6 congressional districts, each district is going to be about 16% of Louisiana. So the legislature drew the districts so that there would be one district where most of the black vote was, or 16% of the black vote was, and the other 5 districts had smaller representation from black folks, and they all ended up being white folks. The partisan breakdown in this example was the black district ended up being Democrat, and I believe the other 5 were Republican, though I'm not certain. This was brought to the courts, the federal courts, and they determined that Louisiana legislature had drawn using race in a way to prevent representation. So the federal court decided Louisiana should redraw their congressional districts so that 2, or about 32%, had African American representation in the districts sufficient to make them competitive for black representation in the House. Now, this again is in front of the Supreme Court a second time, and the Supreme Court hearings were, I think, in September, and it did look as if most members of the Supreme Court were ready to overturn this aspect of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and thus take away the ability to have race as a consideration in drawing districts, and take away the ability to have minority-majority districts. Now, let me caveat here, when we get to the question and answer section, I am not a lawyer, so I may fumble this if there are questions around it. If indeed the Voting Rights Act is overturned, or the minority-majority part of the Voting Rights Act is overturned by the Supreme Court based on the Louisiana Supreme Court action, it is likely that we will see 19 African American members of the U.S. House lose their seats, and we will likely see 4 or 5 Latino members of the U.S. House lose their seats. That would total 23 to 24 people of color gone from the U.S. House of Representatives. Currently, there are 139 members of the U.S. House who are people of color out of 435. And it is likely that that number would drop to 115 based on a Supreme Court decision. If we just use raw numbers, about 38.4% of the United States population are people of color. And so 38.4% of the U.S. House of Representatives is 167. So again, if the Supreme Court overturns this part of the Voting Rights Act, it's likely we could have 115 people of color, in the U.S. House instead of the 167 that is equivalent with population. That's a delta of about 52 people. Now, if indeed gerrymandering can create situations that make governing and solutions hard, what are solutions? One solution is, like Montana, to have an independent redistricting commission where you get unbiased, neutral people to look at the population, look at the geography, and figure out what is the most representative and thoughtful way to divide the state into districts. A number of states have independent commissions. The United Kingdom Australia, a number of countries use independent commissions to draw their representative districts. Some states require that people like retired judges who have a history and almost a genetic makeup to be unbiased to help draw districts. Another way, as we see continued advances in computing, is to use computer programs to determine how can you draw the most competitive and representative and sensible House districts. The challenge with computing is that coin has two sides, and we are seeing some computer programs now being used to determine how a state can carve up their congressional districts to the maximum advantage of one party or the other. So there's an element of human input here that is pretty meaningful. Congress could pass a law to outlaw gerrymandering, and in 2017 and 2022, both legislation was introduced for this purpose. Now, once it passed the US House, if it did, it would likely need 60 votes in the Senate, and that could be a high bar. Many states have passed ballot initiatives requiring independent commissions or unbiased congressional redistricting, and that's another route. Finally, in states in Iowa, they have a bureaucracy called the Legislative Services Bureau that determines their congressional districts, and it's often heralded as a great example of not gerrymandered and balanced representation. Something similar could be done using the US Census. So that's a pretty basic, I'm not even sure we could say 100 level course on gerrymandering and on representation and how it impacts government. So Dina, perhaps you have questions or folks online have questions.
Well, thank you for a very comprehensive explanation of gerrymandering. It's been in the news very frequently recently, so I encourage you all to pose your questions. So I do have a few questions of my own. We have a few questions that were pre-submitted, and again, please go ahead and pose your questions in the Q&A box. We have about a half hour remaining in this hour-long first take. So let me start with the question of how do you distinguish between legal redistricting and illegal gerrymandering?
In many ways, it's all legal currently, though the Supreme Court may determine a district drawn that has a negative impact on race has to be reconsidered. But other than race, again, I'm not an attorney, other than race, I'm not sure that the Supreme Court has found any state's effort at gerrymandering to be illegal. And if indeed they overturn parts of the Voting Rights Act, there's not much space for illegal gerrymandering. And I believe the Constitution leaves congressional districts up currently to states. So it ends up being about, have the people of the state passed a ballot initiative? Is the legislature inclined to find a careful balance? And unfortunately, when I talked about the context of the moment, social media and other things pulling people to the far extremes, legislatures aren't necessarily rewarded for drawing careful districts unless ballot initiatives have said they have to be balanced and careful districts.
So do you see gerrymandering just as part of the rules of the game going forward in the United States?
Many people do. And unfortunately, I think it has very negative impacts for governance. Through some of the numbers I shared with you, you could see that over a long time horizon, more and more seats were getting gerrymandered, fewer seats were competitive. And I think when fewer seats are competitive, when there are fewer moderates, there's less compromise. Senator Kennedy used to, and he was in the Senate 40 some years. He used to talk about when he was a new senator in 1963 that senators would play politics on the 10% on the far left and 10% on the far right. But in the 80% in the middle, they would work together to govern. By the time he passed away in 2009, he would say that they would play politics, each side, the 25% on the left, the 25% on the right, but they would still govern together on the 50% in the middle. I would argue today that politics is played 45% on the left, 45% on the right, and 10% of our time is spent governing together. When I was growing up, I think about how Senator Kennedy and Senator Hatch and their House counterparts passed the Ryan White Care Act to take on the burgeoning HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s. Today, you think about all of the challenges with health insurance, the fiscal stability of Social Security, Medicare, our debt, trade, appropriations. If there were more moderates, if we had fewer gerrymandered districts, you would see more people working to find solutions in the middle. And sure, maybe our most base partisan instincts would not get addressed as often as we want our base partisan instincts to be addressed, but we'd have stable Social Security, stable Medicare, a smooth appropriations process. We'd find a solution to insurance rates going up. So I do think yes, gerrymandering has long been part of our history and part of the game, but it's not a good part, and I think we all deserve better.
Well, we have a question here from Richard. Based on your interpretation of legal versus illegal, do you feel California's ballot initiative will be viewed as legal?
Again, Richard, I'll be very clear. It was all I could do to get through my undergraduate degree, and the thought of law school just did not appeal. I am not a lawyer, and I think that the way California just redistricted with a ballot initiative, the way the Texas legislature just redistricted, these are decisions that are left to the states, and I imagine they will both be found legal. But again, the giant caveat is I am far from an attorney.
So how does gerrymandering impact civil society and civic engagement?
Again, social media, primary elections, gerrymandered districts, all of this right now is pulling many of us into the furthest corners of our party, be it left or right, and rewarding us and making us feel good when our base instincts are celebrated. But none of it is rewarding thoughtful solutions, bipartisan solutions. And while gerrymandering impacts a lack of bipartisan legislation, it also impacts the way we see one another in our communities. It impacts the social aspects. People are moving to districts that align with their politics rather than moving to a place they want to live. I think there is an extension of gerrymandering that makes us a little less civil, a little less civic minded. And we should want good solutions. If you take politics out of it, I suspect many of you have worked in government, worked at the university, or worked in business. And whenever a problem was coming along, in business, you would work to figure out the solution. You didn't take two sides that were incredibly entrenched only to never find a solution. you found a solution to move your business forward. We should be doing the same with government, and we should be encouraging the systems and redistricting to support finding solutions.
So Jane asks to please comment on the Republican Party in Texas redistricting this year to gain 5 more seats, answered by California doing the same to gain 5 seats for Democrats. You've already addressed this a little bit, but what more might you want to share about this situation?
Jane, I think there's something about norms. Part of civil society, part of civility is knowing that there are norms and rules by which we will all abide. Lawyers will tell the truth in front of judges. The census will count Americans every 10 years. Redistricting will follow the census. Having a functional democracy and government, in part, is dependent on all of us agreeing to and following some shared norms, not shooting each other when we have a disagreement. I think that in recent years, many norms have been shattered or displaced. It's making us less civil. And I think both legislative redistricting and initiative-based redistricting happening now in between the normal 10-year cycles is bad for all of us, both sides. It just is one more statement, one more scream into the wind that norms don't matter, our shared values, the unspoken agreement that we will do certain things out of respect and out of tradition doesn't matter. What matters is all for one party, all for the other party. So I think both are unfortunate. And I think there is some value in respecting norms for civil society.
So you use the example of Montana in the commission here. David asks, what would it take to have all states to have unbiased, unelected commissions to draw the districts?
David, I think the way that would likely happen is ballot initiatives. It could happen through a law in Congress, but I think it's not going to happen through Congress. So ballot initiatives would be the way to do that. There is a group, I am forgetting the name of, that looks at creative and new solutions in a nonpartisan way for our democracy. And they advocate for things like ballot initiatives in all states to create fair and balanced legislative and congressional districts. I think that would be the best path to get that done. And, you maybe don't have to do it in all 50 states. It's possible that with time, the norm becomes unbiased, thoughtful, balanced districts, and it creates some amount of pressure on all states to move toward that.
So following on that theme, Scott asks, even though Montana is pretty good with a more balanced redistricting committee, many citizens still believe it's all gerrymandered. This results in a disbelieving younger people. As a legislator, I find that Montana government is very accessible. How might we get Montana youth to believe that it's worth participating and even enough to vote?
First off, Scott, thank you for your service and putting your name on the ballot and showing up. That's incredibly courageous. One of the things when I worked for Senator Tester that he would do, as he traveled around the state, finding different ways to meet different groups of people, maybe Democrat, maybe Republican, maybe independent, may not give a hoot, I censored myself from swearing, about politics and partisan. And he would find different ways to meet them. realtors, educators, small business owners, businesses that work in exports, businesses in tourism, colleges. Anytime he was in a town that had a community college, a tribal college, one of our colleges, on Fridays he would host pizza for the young folks to talk to them, listen to them, answer their questions. And we all know young folks are always happy to have free food, and you got to schedule it early enough for them to go out and drink afterwards. But doing things like that to reach out to people who aren't engaged in government, who do believe that everything is gerrymandered and everything is rigged, figuring out how to meet people where they are. Scott, let me say another word about the work we do at my organizations. We use outrageously high volume direct mail and digital outreach, written at a 4th to 8th grade reading level, to reach people either on their smartphone or in their mailbox and register to them to vote, help them sign up to vote by mail, and get out to vote. And we do that because so many people feel like government isn't interested in me. It's too hard to register to vote, and so they don't do it. The other thing I would say, Scott, when I think about our work registering and turning out people, and I think about your question of how do we get people involved, most Americans, most Montanans are incredibly focused on food, clothing, and shelter. They need to earn enough money to put food on the table for them and their families. They need to be able to afford rent or a mortgage. After they've worked 1 or 2 jobs, they're coming home and cooking, helping the kids with homework. Maybe they have time for an hour of TV before they pass out in bed, wake up, and do it all again. And I think too often, folks in government, folks in my work of trying to engage people in our democracy, forget that people are just stretched thin doing all they can to earn, to buy food, to pay rent, to help their kids. And now I think increasingly we're watching folks have to care for little ones at the same time as they are caring for aging parents, and it stretches them thin. So I think some of it is figuring out ways to be with people who may feel disenfranchised, uninterested, where they're at. And for government to figure out ways. This again, if we had less gerrymandering and more people in the middle figuring out good societal solutions for caring for your children and your aging parents at the same time without going broke. I don't know if that answered your question, but I tried.
So, assuming a racial metric is eliminated, what factors, such as wealth, education, rural, urban, party, or others, would be used by unbiased redistricting commissions for determining districts? If party is used, what would those commissions do with registered independent voters?
So I think it would be for unbiased redistricting. I think it would be number of people, and to the extent possible, can you draw county lines? Can you draw city lines in a contiguous way so that you're not cutting up counties, cutting up cities? And I think if it is truly unbiased, to some extent, you need to minimize the extent to which you use partisan data to draw a district.
Okay. So, how does the Citizens United issue impact the increase in gerrymandering?
Citizens United has created a situation where unlimited money can be used in politics. As an example, 1999, I was a fundraiser and bookkeeper for Senator Kennedy's Senate reelection. And my memory is we were pretty thrilled if we had a total of $6 million for his reelection. I think we had 3 million left over from 94, and we raised 3 million. I believe Senator Tester's 2024 race was north of $100 million. And then you think about food banks, you think about housing, you think about any number of other issues that could use some money. And Citizens United has created a situation where untold amounts of money are going into politics. It is also pushing people to the extremes and not to find shared solutions, to draw districts so that moneyed interests are well taken care of instead of sensible paths forward. I think it's not a direct connection between Citizens United, but there is a dotted line between money and politics and drawing districts interested in supporting moneyed interests.
So there's a lot of concern about AI engagement in the world today. Do you think that AI could be used to be helpful and to contribute to unbiased redistricting?
Archie, I used AI this week for my first time in taking a photograph of a friend and I and asking AI or Gemini to put us in Christmas elf costumes. I was incredibly impressed with what AI could do, putting us in Christmas elf costumes. Yes, I believe AI could be used incredibly well in figuring out sensible, competitive, representative districts. Yes, I think it could be used very well.
So we have a question about the Voting Rights Act. And of course, Mike Mansfield was instrumental in getting that passed. He believed it was the most important legislation of his generation in fulfilling the objectives of the Constitution. Again, that was something that we worked on in a bipartisan fashion with Everett Dirksen. So Joe notes, it is argued that the Voting Rights Act is no longer needed because race relations have improved. Just the fact that dozens of people of color will no longer be in Congress if these protections are removed demonstrates that they are clearly still needed. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree. And I also think it goes beyond race relations to representation. An earlier question from Scott was, how do you get people involved in government or willing to register to vote or turn out to vote when they think it's all rigged against them? I think when young people, this is a true statement in this moment as you're hearing so many people talk about older folks continuing to serve in government. When young people don't see their faces in government, they don't feel inclined to register and vote. Without the Voting Rights Act in full, if Black folks are not seeing themselves represented in government, they're going to be less inclined to vote. Their needs will be less represented, and it could result in really negative outcomes. That's true for Native American, Asian, women. Absent the Voting Rights Act, representation could get pretty bad. I also think race relations are not as remedied as many of us would hope. This morning, I was listening to an interview with Ezra Klein and another journalist, talking about how Jewish folks are treated on the far right today. I think there are a number of examples in the press in the last 8 weeks of attitudes towards Jewish folks, toward women, toward people of color, towards gay folks that indicate the Voting Rights Act is still needed, and that just beneath the surface, there's a great desire to limit the engagement, involvement, and rights of some populations in the US.
So we also have a few questions that were submitted in advance of your dialogue today. So I'm trying to adapt them a little bit to ensure that what you've said is incorporated. We do have some questions about best practices across the country. So you talked about Montana's Independent Commission. Can you share examples from other states that might be a bit different that are widely considered a best practice and what we could learn from them?
Iowa is the best example I can go to. Um, my memory is that Iowa has 4 congressional districts. Neatly, Iowa is shaped like a rectangle, as are the 4 districts, coincidentally. But their Bureau of Legislative Services has done a very nice job in recent years of dividing up the state with good competition and good representation in each of the 4 districts. And when you talk to Iowans, Democrat or Republican, and I believe all 4 seats are currently Republican, but in the last 10 years, at least 2 of the seats have gone back and forth regularly. I think Iowans are generally supportive of the process they use. So I think Iowa is the best example outside of independent redistricting commissions.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to ask you a few more general questions about voting beyond gerrymandering, if that's all right.
Sure.
We do have one on the Voting Rights Act, and how does the John Lewis proposal improve the Voting Rights Act?
In many ways, it reauthorizes the Voting Rights Act, so some of the existing protections will continue, so that the Department of Justice can continue to monitor geographies that have historically worked to keep some people from voting, largely people of color. And that needs to continue. When you watch, since January 2021, over 4,000 pieces of legislation have been introduced in state legislatures to change voting. And they're different changes. Sometimes it's get rid of drop boxes. Sometimes it is eliminate vote by mail, reduce the window in which you can vote by mail, eliminate in-person early voting, reduce the window for in-person early voting. In Montana, requiring your birth date be written on the outside envelope, your birth year, for voting by mail, which I believe has resulted in 10% in a tenfold increase in the rejection rate amongst Montana ballots. Many of these legislative efforts to change the rules of voting are designed to do 2 things. 1, reduce minority populations from voting, and 2, confuse voters so that voters don't remember, oh my God, can I early vote in person? Can I vote by mail? Do I need an ID? Do I need my passport? Hooey, it's all too much. I'm not going to vote. Create confusion so fewer people vote. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act needs to be reauthorized because the efforts to keep people of color from voting are continuing, and there needs to be strong federal oversight and monitoring of those efforts.
Should the Voting Rights Act become obsolete if the Supreme Court overturns it? What are your thoughts for ways to overcome the consequences which are possibly coming?
The best way for me to answer that question is from the chair I sit in at the Voter Participation Center. This year, for the first time, we are running our voter registration program in nearly every state. There are 4 states that we legally can't. So in 46 states, we are sending voter registration mail to unregistered people at a 4th to 8th grade reading level, making it very easy for them to register. And we will do the same with voter turnout efforts because we have to. If the Supreme Court overturns the Voting Rights Act, I think it is incumbent on people who would like to have a truly representative and inclusive electorate to give time and money to nonpartisan efforts to register and turn out people.
Well, I want to revisit that at the end because I think that's a great message to leave people on. But since we have a couple other minutes, someone asks, what reforms outside of redistricting could help rebalance polarization, such as ranked choice voting, open primaries, or other ideas?
I think open primaries could be good. I will tell you, I worry a little bit about ranked choice voting. One of my concerns is if some people already find voting, registering, turning out confusing, is it possible that ranked choice voting, instead of just picking the one they want, will add to confusion and inadvertently dissuade some folks from voting? That worries me. I think all of us engaging in our regular lives in a manner that creates space for conversation and finding solutions instead of being in the extreme corners. I think the work of the Mansfield Center and universities all over the country to create space for civil conversation and civic engagement is very important. I also think finding ways to have a shared understanding of truth, and that truth is indeed a true north. There is a set of facts that are shared and real. I think that's important. When we start picking our own facts or adjusting or shading the facts, it makes it really easy to justify behavior that is undemocratic and rather biased.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you for this fascinating discussion today. Thank you also for being such a dedicated member of the Mansfield Board of Advisors and supporting the Mansfield legacy. Both of us work for nonpartisan organizations that support democracy and civic engagement in this country. So I'll just go back to what you were saying before. If you care deeply about our democracy, honoring the Constitution and the ideals of our founders, support Get Out the Vote efforts with your time, with your money, with sharing this conversation with others. So thank you again, Tom, and thank you to each one of you for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you, Dina, and thanks to the university and the Mansfield Center.